After 7 years in the markets, making hundreds of thousands of dollars from both prop firms and personally funded accounts, and helping hundreds of other traders see the same results, I can confirm that the only ICT key level you need in order to get rich is the fair value gap. It not only can be used for entries, but it can also be used for daily bias, which is the #1 most common ICT concept that traders struggle with. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 steps that will give you an over 80% accuracy on your daily bias. So enough of the chit chat, let's hop on a chart. You need to stop thinking that marking a fair value gap means anything, because this is just going to cause you to be wrong on your bias and lose trades. Instead, I want you to pay attention to these 3 levels in fair value gaps in order to execute and evaluate price action correctly. So the key level #1 we're going to be talking about is going to be the fair value gap open. So if we are looking at a fair value gap, the open is going to be at the bottom of a bearish fair value gap, or it's going to be at the top of a bullish fair value gap. It's just going to be wherever the beginning of the fair value gap is the first area that price will trade into when it hits it. Key level #2 is going to be the fill of the fair value gaps. So this is going to be the opposite end of the fair value gap from where the fair value gap begins. So for example, in a bearish fair value gap, here is the open, and the fill is going to be up here. The third key level is going to be the midpoint of the fair value gap. Now, the midpoint can be found by using a fib tool. You go right up here to the left, and you need to have these settings right here. You can make whatever color you want, but 1, 0, and 0.5 are the settings you need. But I want to be very clear that just understanding these levels alone means nothing if you don't have a set of rules on how to use them consistently. So here are the 3 rules on how to use these levels for fair value gaps for bias. Rule #1 is that if price taps into the fair value gap and fails to close beyond the midpoint, then it is valid, right? So we see right here, the price taps up into it. It does not matter how far the wick goes. The wick could go even out of the fair value gap. As long as the candle body is not closing beyond this line, the fair value gap is valid. Now in step 3, after we go over these next couple rules, I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to use this in a mechanical strategy to get an 80% success rate on daily bias. So you can see again, price travels up into this fair value gap, it fails to close above the midpoint, and price falls. Both times this happened, price fell. Rule #2 is that if price closes beyond the midpoint, it is invalid. Now this just means you're going to wait for the next fair value gap. So if you see right here, price came down into this fair value gap and it closed beyond the midpoint, right? So at that time, we would have just waited for the next fair value gap to use this strategy to find bias. So right after that, the price tapped into this level up here, and then it went to the downside. So if this happens, you're just sitting on your hands and waiting for the next high probability situation. And this is how we keep such a high win rate. Rule #3 is that if price closes through the fair value gap, this is